Good evening, Brantford. Pastor Mark here at Brant Naz, the Brantford Church of the Nazarene, and we're into our Wednesday evening midweek Bible study, the Exploring God series that we're having tonight. And we have been walking through the Sermon on the Mount, and tonight takes us to our sixth study in the Sermon on the Mount. But before we go to that, we're going to look at another passage first. We're going to look at a couple different passages tonight, but we will look at this and walk through this from the start to look at a couple different aspects of it, because it's a very challenging passage tonight, because I think the subject matter affects so many of us as we look at that. If I was to ask you to list the top reasons why marriages fail, what would you include in that list? If I asked you to make a list of the top reasons why marriages fail, what would you add into that list? I'll give you a second to think about that as you do that, the things that we add into a list. It seems that there is no tragedy greater or as difficult to go through as when a relationship that God meant for love and fulfillment deteriorates into a relationship of discord and repair, or despair, sorry. Divorce is a complex subject, a complex matter, and it touches us on such a deep emotional level that we have there. This topic hits home to many of us, and I'm fairly confident that if I was to suggest to all of us that are watching this, if I was to ask you, if I was to ask you if divorce has affected you, I think we would all say in some way divorce has affected us, whether it's us individually, whether it's us collectively, whether it's us through a family member. It could be a child, it could be a sibling, it could be a parent, it could be ourselves. But I think we've all been directly touched by divorce. In my family, I'm a bit of an anomaly, a bit of an oddball from the perspective of I have not been divorced. Lorene and I have been married for 39 years, better get that right, 39 years just this past April. My mother was divorced 3 times. My sister, when she was alive, she had been divorced. My one brother has been divorced. My other brother, although not divorced, has been separated. And my grandparents were even divorced. And that's just the immediate family around me, and it just expands from there. And I think if I was to ask you, you could list all sorts of relatives and friends who come within that. The divorce has touched you very closely. It's not unfamiliar to us. It's very common in today's culture and society. Well, today's subject matter from the Sermon on the Mount deals with the matter of divorce. And we're not going to begin there, though, in the Sermon on the Mount itself. We're going to begin in Matthew chapter 19. I'm going to look at verses 1 to 9 first, because it talks about that. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 19. And a little later, we're going to look at a passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And in between that, this passage from Matthew chapter 5. So Matthew chapter 19. I'm going to read that for us, the first 9 verses of Matthew chapter 19, make some comments on it, and probably ask some questions in there to do that. But as we do, we can think of all sorts of reasons why marriages end in divorce. I was talking to someone today, and they said one of the common factors is finances. We can see that. There's unfaithfulness in them. One of the core things I have found in being a pastor and serving people who are going through relationship difficulties is often, even in those things, the finances, the unfaithfulness in that, one of the core things it comes down to is communication, or lack of communication, or difficulty in communication, that we're not sure how to communicate with one another, so we don't communicate with one another, and we just take actions to do that. But let me read the passage for us in Matthew chapter 19, starting at the first verse. When Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea, to the other side of the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" Jesus said, "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh'? So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because of your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. The disciples said to him, if this is a situation between a husband and a wife, is it better not to marry? And then Jesus comments on it from there about the position of marriage with that. So as we look at the context here, where the Pharisees, they asked Jesus a question, and did Jesus answer their question? Think about that. When we look at that, did they ask them a question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Did Jesus answer that question? Well, we see there that he hasn't answered that question, because what he does is he answers it with a question. And Jesus often did that. He answers it with a question. He draws them to the scriptures themselves. And Moses, as he comments, and we're going to comment on it in a few minutes as well, that Moses didn't command them to give a certificate of divorce, but Moses had permitted it, as verse 8 tells us, that Moses allowed that to happen. So these people ask the question, but Jesus doesn't outright answer it. He draws them back to the scripture. There were two rabbis. Rabbi Shammai, he taught that divorce was only permitted in extreme circumstances. And then Rabbi Hillel had taught that divorce was permitted for any and every reason for them. And so with that in mind, these Pharisees, they seem to be trying to accomplish something in verse 3 when it says there, the Pharisees came to him, to test Jesus. They wanted to try Jesus out on that. What's his thought on this? Is he going to go with the one side of Rabbi Shammai or the other side with Rabbi Hillel? And they're doing that. They were either trying to trap him or they were trying to justify their own position that they had. Sometimes we can see our children do that with us. When those of us that have had children and when they're young, and they go and ask mommy for something and she says no or whatever, and then they go and ask daddy to see if they can get the answer that they're really looking for to do that. Sometimes in a relationship we can see where someone may ask a question, and when you answer that question, they don't like the answer, so they go on and ask someone else. What they really want is they don't want to hear your answer. What they want to hear is their answer from your mouth, to hear that. And that's possibly what these Pharisees are doing here. They're coming to Jesus and they're seeking the answer that they want. They were either trying to trap Jesus, or they were trying to either adding to or taking away from the law that they had come to, the law that said you shouldn't take away from the law. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, you don't need to turn there in a Bible or open a Bible today. I'm just going to read it for us, so listen to that. In Deuteronomy 24, the first two verses, it says, Now Israel, hear the decrees and the laws I am about to teach you. Follow them so that you may live and may go in and take possession of the land of the Lord, the God of your ancestors is giving you. Do not add to what I command you, and do not subtract from it, but keep the commands of the Lord your God I give you. One of the things that the Pharisees used to do quite often, when Deuteronomy says, do not add to the commands I give to you, and do not subtract from it. For themselves, they would do all they could to subtract from the law. But when it came to applying the law to others, they would do all they could to add to the law to do that. And that seems to be what they're trying to do here. They're trying to get themselves so that the law satisfies their position. But if it's to go against someone else, they're going to try and have the law add to the law to do that. Well, back here in Matthew 19, particularly verses 4 to 6, in Jesus' response here, he begins pointing them back to the Genesis account of creation and God's original design for marriage. When it says, haven't you read that at the beginning of the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his mother and father and be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they were no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. See, that's not something us pastors just say at weddings, what God has brought together, let no one separate. That was God's design for a male and a female to come together, and the two are to join together, and no one shall separate that. God made us different, but though different, we're meant to be suited for one another. and He's brought us together that way. And we're not only suited for one another, but God has brought us together. God has joined us together. And Jesus is focusing on the institute of marriage, not on the grounds of divorce. So when they come to Him and talk about this divorce, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Jesus doesn't talk about divorce at first. He brings them down to the original purpose of marriage, that God bringing two together to be one in that image together. But then they question Him further in verse 7. Why then, they asked, did Moses command the man to give his wife a certificate of divorce? They were looking for anything, any reason they could to issue a certificate of divorce, just for any little reason. But Jesus gives them the instruction here in verse 9. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery. That person does that. When we see how God has designed marriage and what marriage is to be, we understand that there are two, I'm going to call them institutions, two buildings or entities that God has created to build His foundation of. One is the church, the other is marriage. The two foundations that we have is one is the church and the other is marriage. And so when we look at the importance that God places on the marriage relationship, what difference should it make if we understand what God's perspective is on marriage and God's design for marriage is, and not just a cultural or the laws of the day? What should that bring about in us? When we realize what God's purpose for marriage is, bringing the two together to be one, and His purpose in marriage, how should that change our view of marriage compared to if we just look at it from a cultural perspective or from a legal perspective? What should that make us do and have a perspective of marriage? Well, I would suggest to us that it should lead us to be more committed in marriage. When we realize marriage isn't just something that the laws of the government of the land have dictated, and here's how we're going to have a marriage. Marriage isn't just something that we socially accept, and they are those parts. There are the government officials involved in it. There is the social end of it. But when we realize that it's God's design of what He wants our relationship to be, we should be more committed to it. We should hold stronger to it. In verse 7 of this, the Pharisees refer to Moses' instruction, as I said earlier, this command that He gave them. But how does Jesus respond in verse 8? Does He call it a command, or what does He call it? You can respond to that, and I'll keep going in a minute here, but it'll catch up, and you'll see on your feed. It'll come with that. How does Jesus respond to their statement that, well, Moses commanded this of us? Doug Ottman, I see you responding there probably to the last point that we had. Yeah, we need to work hard at marriage. I've often said with marriage and that, like I mentioned, Lorene and I have been married for 39 years. And when people ask me, okay, what's your success, if you want to call it that? Well, obviously God involved in the marriage. But something I often say is, you have to continually work at your marriage. It doesn't mean marriage is a chore, but you have to continually work at your marriage, because if you stop working at your marriage begins to deteriorate and fall apart. You're not giving the attention to it that it needs. But as we come here and see where the command was, the Pharisees were saying Moses commanded it, but Jesus responds and He says, Moses permitted you. He didn't command you, He permitted you. And what I really notice here is where He says, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. Why? Because of your hearts were hard. Because your hearts were hard. That should speak to us quite clearly when we see that, when we look at how God looks at marriage and how we should hold to it, and yet their hearts were hard. So Moses said, okay, then you can get divorced for that. Your hearts are hard. Well, let's go to the Sermon on the Mount then itself in Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 to 32, and see what Jesus has to say here as we look at this further. Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 and 32. And I'm going to read that for us. Listen to the Word of God. And remember how I said last week of many of these sections, each of these sections that are beginning now, they all begin with, you have heard it said, and but I tell you, and this and this. This is when he said a little different. He said, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. So that's what's been said in the culture. That's been said amongst the religious leaders. Anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you, anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, just to explain this, as we see this, one of the if you want to say the permissions of this allowing for divorce is marital unfaithfulness. In using the words that they have here, but I tell you, anyone divorced except for sexual immorality, dealing specifically with it. That word for sexual immorality, in the original language of the Bible, it was porneia. It's the one that we get pornography from. And so there's gross or repeated sexual offense that's occurring in there, and there's an exception to that. So what he's saying here is, if you divorce your wife for another reason besides that, just because, like, they were looking for any and every reason. And it could be, well, she doesn't clean the house properly, or this didn't happen, or that didn't happen. I just don't like the way she looks now, or whatever. They look for any reason. And you divorce her for that, you're really causing her to be an adulterer when someone comes with her, because you haven't been divorced properly. You haven't been divorced for a reason that God allows that. So when adultery is involved in it, though, the sexual immorality is involved in it, Jesus is saying this is a permissible thing. Not a commanded thing, but a permissible thing to have that happen. But I tell you that anyone divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. So she's not the adulterer; she's the victim of it. When you've done that, when we see the concept here that they have with it, this English word that we get of the gross or the strong sexual immorality of it. So he isn't saying here that the woman is the adulterer. Is causes someone to be the adultery. But if you divorce her for just any reason, except sexual immorality, you're basically turning her over to be an adulterer, although she is not really the adultery to do that. I just see a comment caught there. Well, what about abuse? I'm going to go to 1 Corinthians 7. If you want to, well, I've commented on that. Turn your Bible to 1 Corinthians 7. And I'm going to talk about abuse there, because we can talk about another exception here that we see to it. But in an abuse situation, if someone is abusing someone, I'm never going to say to someone, well, just stay in that relationship. You need to just rely on God to keep you in that relationship. This Sunday I'm talking about the people that Peter was speaking to and how they were persecuted in that. And Jesus said, you're going to face trials of many kinds. Well, it doesn't mean that you need to stay in those just because we're going to have trials many times, you need to stay in that relationship. No, we need to think of, one is safety. I will always counsel someone that if you're in an abusive situation, and hear me too, it's not just physical abuse. Many times, and maybe possibly most, I won't say that because I don't have the figures to prove it, but many times the abuse doesn't have to be physical. It can be psychological. Mental abuse is how we abuse somebody. And if that is happening, I'm going to encourage someone to get out of that situation and remove yourself from that situation so that you're in safety. Not just physical safety, although it is physical safety, but mental safety as well, to do that, to be able to do that. But as we come here, I want to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 7 to 12, as we have it here. Sorry, 1 Corinthians 7, verses 12 to 16. So it says here, Paul is saying to the believers at Corinth, when he speaks to them, he says, to the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. So this is what Paul's saying. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. And then in verse 15, but if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know? How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? So this is the situation in here where it's saying, if you are a believer and you are married to an unbeliever, and the unbeliever wants to stay in the relationship, then as an unbeliever you need to stay in the relationship. Sorry, as a believer you need to stay in the relationship. But if the unbeliever says, I want out of the relationship, then you as a believer need to allow them to go out of the relationship and not stop. Now, it's not in a sense peace at all cost, but peace is involved with this. In verse 15, where it says, but if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or sister is not bound to such a circumstance. God has called us to live in peace. And then he goes on to suggest there, how do you know, wife, whether you will be saved, whether you will save your husband? And same thing to the wife. How do you know, to the husband, how do you know that you'll save your wife? What is being said here is, if the unbeliever wants to leave, it's important to live at peace. If we refuse to do that, all we're going to do is embitter them, then they may never come to the Lord. But if they go to leave, we're not going to hold the reins back on them, and they leave, then we're keeping the peace, and there's probably a better chance that they would come to the Lord, that they're not going to grow embittered towards us, or less likely to grow embittered towards us to do that. But let's go back to the Sermon on the Mount, back to Matthew chapter 5. And we see the piece on divorce that we just looked at in that thing. Well, right after that, the next section that I want us to look at, starting at verse 33, it talks about oaths. Let me read that, then we'll make some comments on it to do that. The oaths. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you may have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, even by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. And you need to say, all you need to say simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. So we've got an interesting follow-up here to the teaching on divorce that Jesus had. A very short. I took it further when we went to Corinthians and we went to Matthew chapter 19 to look at it further, to look at some of these other reasons that God allowed divorce and the reasons for them there, both the unbelievers and the sexual immorality, and that God was allowing it, not commanding it. But it's followed up, this teaching, it's followed up with one on oaths. And as we look at this and we see this one on oaths, we follow this up on the one of oaths because when we look at it, what is marriage in a sense? We are taking an oath to each other, and ideally, if we're believers, we're taking an oath to God too. There's a cord of two strands is strong, but one of three strands cannot be broken. There's the one partner, the other partner, and God make the three strands come together, and it can't be broken. So when Jesus says here of the oaths, it does connect with the marriages in that. When we make an oath in a marriage, we need to take it seriously. It's not just a civil agreement. It's not just a legal agreement. It's an oath before God. It's an oath to one another, and we need to hold to that strongly. So Jesus is talking about that here too in the context of this, and it's important to catch that. But then if we go and read in Matthew chapter 23, Matthew chapter 23, the 16th to 22nd verses, let me read that for us. Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by an oath. So the Pharisees held that if you swear by the temple, well, that doesn't mean anything. But if you swear by the gold of the temple, that means something to do it. They're bound by the oath. You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift on the altar, it is bound to an oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So here they were saying, they were trying to justify their oaths and their commitments that they were making. And when Jesus talks in the Sermon on the Mount here in Matthew chapter 5, he's talking about it here with the oaths. It does connect to this matter of marriage, because we need to stay committed to it and not look for the little reasons that they were looking for. See, they said, oh, the temple, doesn't matter if you swear by that because it's not binding. But the gold on the temple for some reason was. The altar isn't binding if you swear by that, but don't swear by the sacrifice that is on the altar. Various reasons that they were looking for to get out of what they had. But Jesus is basically saying here with these oaths, he says, because we have no control over the oath. Like he even refers there to the hair on our head, as we looked at before. And do not swear by your head. You cannot make even one hair white or black. And some of us probably don't have any hair that we can make it white or black or any color for that matter. But we can't control that. So he's saying, don't be taking that. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. This is not a direct quote from the law of any of the law of Moses when he says this, but it's a summary of the Old Testament principles they had in doing that. So should this mean that we should refuse to give evidence if we're asked to give an oath in a court of law or testify under an oath of court of law? Well, no, it does not mean that necessarily. One thing, in my understanding, is even in our courts of law now, we can ask not to be required to swear on a Bible, but to just affirm that what we testify is true. So if we go into a court, when they ask you to take the Bible, we don't have to take the Bible. We can say, could I just affirm that I'm telling the truth? And you can make a commitment that way. But honest people don't need to resort to take an oath, is what Jesus is getting at here. The real emphasis is to live our life in such a way that our yes is yes and our no is no. It's not a matter of words where Jesus says all you need to say is a simple yes or a no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. Well, it's not just a matter of saying yes and saying no, but it's living our life in such a way that the yes is yes and the no is no. One of the requirements of leaders in the church, elders in the church, is that they need to be able to teach. And some people have taken that to mean, well, they need to be able to teach in an understandable way, which I believe they do. They need to be able to teach in a way that they know the material that they have. I believe they do. But in a greater way, they need to be able to teach so that what they teach is believable. If someone teaches you on, well, we said one of the causes for breakdown in marriage can be finances. Well, if someone is teaching you on finances or teaching about finances and they're living their life a mess in their finances, it's not a believable thing then. Why should I believe what you're saying about finances when you can't even live that out in your own life? So Jesus is saying here with these oaths, let your yes be yes or your no, no. Just simply a yes or no is what you offer for that, to do that. It reminds me of, Lorena was telling me last week as she came back from the United States from working last weekend, she came back on Friday evening and the Border Patrol officer asked her a question if she was leaving any of the belongings in the car here in Canada. And she knows she was moving personal belongings and she had some groceries. She says, well, I think she said something to the effect, well, I don't think so. He says, well, it's not a don't think so answer. It's a yes or no answer. What he wanted for. Well, when you're staying for a long time, there's a chance that you're going to leave something behind, but there's no plan to leave it behind. But basically, he wanted a yes or no answer. And Jesus is saying, live your life in such a way so that it is a yes and a no is a no. They should be unnecessary. Oaths should be unnecessary for followers of Jesus, because this is not so much about being the prohibition about oaths as we see here, but it is an instruction on how we should live our lives. This is how we should be living our lives. Like this is what Jesus is trying to drive at home. So just to pull that together, to pull this together with the two of the divorce and the oaths. The religious leaders of the day, the Pharisees in particular, they were looking for any and every excuse they could to make lax the laws that they had for their own benefit. And they were looking for any way they could to make tight the laws so they could go after others who weren't holding up to it. So they're holding a double standard there. And Jesus comes into this and he recognizes, okay, divorce is never commanded, but divorce is permitted. It is permitted on the grounds of sexual immorality, when some of these people were looking for just any grounds they could do it. And there was a caution, not against the divorcee, if you want to say that, but against the divorcer. That if you divorce someone for a reason that is not scriptural, either for sexual immorality, here, if you divorce them, you're really, look at the damage you're causing. You're causing them to become an adulterer. And it's not the responsibility of the person being divorced, it's the responsibility of the person who is divorcing. And then as we looked in from 1 Corinthians 7, I believe it was, when we looked at the person who's married to an unbeliever. If the unbeliever wants to stay, let them stay. If the unbeliever wants to leave, let them leave. To do that, those exceptions that we could see to it there. But he pulls it in and he tied it into the creation account of what marriage is. God has brought the two together to be one. And when we look particularly at the New Testament book of Ephesians, and it describes the marriage relationship as the example of Christ's relationship with the church. See, a marriage relationship is supposed to be a living example, a living illustration of what Christ's relationship with the church is like. And so that's why this is looked at so strongly like this. When the two become one, and we take this commitment, we take this oath toward it, that we need to take that seriously. Like I said, it's not just a civil action, it's not just a legal action, it's not just a cultural action, but it's actually what God has brought into us. I just see a question here, but doesn't it also say that no one can marry a divorced woman? I believe, Linda, in the context of that it has there, it's talking about the woman there that was divorced, like the husband divorced her for just any old reason. It's what it's referring to there. It's not talking about if the divorce is given under these allowable grounds. It's talking about there that, and it's not a condemnation for, if you want to say, for the woman whose husband divorced her for just any reason. It's a condemnation on the husband that has divorced her. See what you are doing? He's saying, this is how serious this is. If you just do this for any reason, this is how serious this is. But if the divorce has happened because of adultery, I see it as here, the way I understand it here, both here and 1 Corinthians 7 that we looked at, was that that would not make the woman an adulterer in that sense, and she would be free to remarry again. Now, I want to say, there are others out there that would feel differently about remarriage. The way I'm understanding it here, the remarriage would be possible through it if there's been a divorce that's permissible under God's standards here. But the condemnation here, the admonition here is not to the woman. The admonition here is to the person seeking a divorce, saying, listen, you can't just do it for any reason. So that's where it's coming from there. Like I said, this is a very difficult topic, probably because divorce is so common in our society and our culture today. Like I commented earlier, my mother had been divorced 3 times. My brother's been divorced. My other brother separated. My sister, when she was alive, she was divorced. My grandparents were divorced. And that's just going that tight circle. If I went out in my family, just my family alone, it doesn't stop in many senses. But it always is a difficult situation. There's so much, if you want to say, heartache and hurt and damage that's caused through a broken relationship, particularly one that ends in divorce. So it becomes a sensitive matter to us, and it's difficult to do. And I would encourage any of you that are watching this, whether it be now or in later days, if you tune in and watch it, if you would want to talk about this further, I would encourage you, contact me and let's talk about that further. You can contact me through the website. There's a contact information there that with all of our, with the church phone number on it, the church email address, and I will get back to you and talk about that further. But for now, I'm going to just close this in prayer right here as we finish with this portion of it, and then we'll look forward to joining back next week and we will look at some sayings that were said there of an eye for an eye, a tooth for tooth, as we often commented at, and is love for your enemies as well, as we bring chapter 5 to a close. But let's just close our time in prayer. Father, I thank you for the love that you have given to us. I thank you for the reconciliation and restoration that you have brought to us in our relationship with you. And as I think of marriage relationships, Father, and so many crumble today, they say upwards to 50%, 70%, whatever it is, Father, I'm seeing numbers all over the place. But Lord, you are the God of restoration. You are the God of reconciliation. And for any of us in the relationships that we are in and we are involved in, Could you help us, Father, to have that attitude of reconciliation, that attitude of restoration, whatever that takes? And I'm not saying, Lord, please make us doormats for other people to walk on. But Father, if we could so have your love flow through us, that we could share it with others, maybe the others that we're in conflict with. It would maybe help to, well, not maybe help, it would help to stop some of the breakdowns we see in our relationships, particularly marriage relationships. So, Father, I commit our marriage relationships to you that we know within the body of the church here, the people that we know in our own families. I commit them to you, Father, and say, Lord, would you protect them? Would you protect them? And when those who are in struggle, would you give them, one, a spirit of humility, but also, two, a spirit of courage, so that they would, the humility, so that they would not be demanding their own way, but that spirit of courage, so that they would be willing to walk forward and seek for reconciliation and restoration in their marriage and do whatever they can possibly do. Your word tells us that as far as possible, live at peace with each other. Help us, Father, to live at peace with each other. But when we add in there and we see as far as possible, we recognize that sometimes that can't be done. Sometimes there is going to be the unbelieving partner that's going to walk out on us. And so, Father, I would pray that you in all of it would help us to live the love of Christ and not, if you want to say, demand our own pound of flesh in it, but we would live the love of Christ and follow through with that. In Christ's name, amen. Thank you for joining us tonight. And just an encouragement, just to let you know, some have been asking, when are we going to start with public services? I'll make an announcement about that during Sunday's worship gathering online. But just seeing as we're here now, just to let you know, we're tentatively planning, got a soft, what we call a soft open date, tentatively planned for August the 2nd. Hoping to have our first in-person worship service for August the 2nd. But there's a whole myriad of planning that needs to go on, of preparation for that, of organization. We need to draw up a plan and submit it to the district for that. We're in contact with the local health board to figure out what we need to do, and not only what we need to do, but what we shouldn't do as well. So if you could keep us in prayer, but we're tentatively setting August the 2nd is our potential first day of an in-person worship service. So let's keep that together. And until we meet again and see each other again, the Lord bless you and the Lord keep you and the Lord give you peace. Amen.